Ordinance number 22 is a request by the Department of Infrastructure and Development to amend the city's Unified Development Ordinance. The UDO is a combination of the city's zoning code and the subdivision control ordinance. It's also chapter 154 of the city code. So the first set of changes that we are considering revolve around solar panels and solar parks. This is, of course, something that has expanded a great bit since the UDO was adopted in 2010. But we don't have a lot of clarity within the UDO for where they are and are not permitted. So the first thing we did with solar panels is just add a definition to Article 11 of the UDO. This is where all of our definitions are. And then after establishing that definition, we're adding solar panels as a permitted accessory use in every zoning district. So in practice, this doesn't actually change very much. We weren't previously restricting solar panels. It just wasn't clear. So we would get phone calls, and residents and planning staff didn't have a lot of clarity in here. So adding solar panels to every zoning district. And then on a larger scale, we also did not have a defined use for solar parks in the UDO. And of course, over the past decade or so, Indiana Municipal Power Agency has installed or is in the process of installing numerous parks around town. So we define solar park and add it as a special exception use in the agricultural, industrial, commercial, low to moderate intensity industrial, and high intensity industrial zoning districts. These are kind of our larger zoning districts that tend to be more on the outer ring of town. And note that these are special exceptions, so they would still require approval from the city's Board of Zoning Appeals. Previously, with the IMPA parks that had gone in, they had gone in under the use of government operations non-office, which is a little ambiguous, and it's a use that's permitted in several zoning districts that we might not necessarily want solar parks to be installed. So this just gives the city a little bit more authority in determining where potential future solar parks might be. And then because there is the precedence of government operations non-office being the use for new solar parks, we're just removing that from several zoning districts. Next, we have government offices. This is really just a brief couple changes to reduce some redundancy in the code. Right now, we have general service office and government office as two separate uses that are essentially permitted in the same places. So we're just eliminating government office as a use and kind of having it absorbed into the general service office definition. Government offices would still be permitted in all of the same districts, just eliminating that redundancy. Next, we have event barns. We've gotten a few calls about these. I've talked with Laura Miller in the County Planning and Zoning Office. I think this is a little more common out in the county, but if you're not familiar, an event barn is just a repurposed barn used as a wedding venue or an event space. It's just not something that we have covered in our code. So we add a pretty lengthy definition of event barns to the UDO, and part of the definition makes clear that an event barn would still need to adhere to all of the same building, fire, and health codes that any other commercial structure would need to adhere to. And with that definition, then we're adding an event barn as a special exception use in the agricultural zoning district. Next, we have accessory dwelling units. These are sometimes referred to as mother-in-law suites or carriage houses. It's basically any secondary attached or detached dwelling on a single-family residential lot. These have become increasingly popular in recent years as a kind of an antidote to housing scarcity or rising housing costs. It's a way to sort of increase your residential housing stock without dramatically changing a neighborhood. I know Indiana's chapter of the AARP has been rather outspoken in encouraging cities in Indiana to reduce restrictions on ADUs. So what we would be doing here, currently, accessory dwelling units are already permitted as a special exception in the agricultural and single-family residential zoning districts, or low-density single-family residential. We would just be changing that from a special exception to a permitted use. So basically, you wouldn't need to go through the Board of Zoning Appeals. It would just be a permitted use on this property. And then we would be adding ADUs as a special exception in all of our other single-family residential zoning districts. And similar to the event barn, an accessory dwelling unit would also have to adhere to all of the same building and zoning codes that any other residential structure would need to adhere to. And because we already allow ADUs in some zoning districts, we do have development standards for them on the books. For instance, they have to be a minimum of 500 square feet. The materials need to complement the primary structure, and those would remain unchanged. We're just kind of expanding where ADUs would be permitted. We have some changes to increase residential density, primarily in our multifamily residential zoning districts. Basically what we're doing here is just taking the density standards that are already in place in the zoning code and just increasing them. So first, in the multifamily residential M1 zoning district, currently we have multifamily dwellings of 4 to 6 units permitted as a special exception. We would just change that to a permitted use. And then we would add multifamily dwellings of 7 to 15 units as a special exception. And then on a larger scale, in the intense multiple family residential M2 district, currently we allow 16 plus unit dwellings as a special exception. That would now just be a permitted, or 16 to 24 would now be a permitted use. And then multifamily dwellings of 24 plus units would be a special exception. And part of the idea here is to increase residential density, but also in the case of the M2 district, it's also just to catch up with a lot of the multifamily dwellings that we already have. A lot of our, like the Merle Henderson apartments, the Interfaith apartments, the recent expansion on Chester Heights, all of those units already kind of exceed the density standards that we have in our UDO. So in a way, we're just kind of catching up to some of this, the apartments that we already have in the M2 district.
Reality.
Yeah. And then we would also be adding multifamily units or dwellings of 7 to 15 units and 16 to 24 units as special exceptions in the general commercial zoning district. Is addiction treatment facilities. Currently, addiction treatment facilities just kind of operate under the more broad medical service offices. So this would separate that out as its own distinct use and then add it as a commercial use in the general commercial and outdoor commercial zoning districts. The idea being that these districts tend to have larger lot sizes and are better capable to handle the higher intensity traffic that's generated at some of these facilities. Next, we have short-term rentals, such as Airbnbs. This is just kind of a blind spot in our code. It's a use that has, of course, rapidly increased over the past decade. And we get a lot of calls about it, and we just can't always provide the best guidance because it's just not a use that we really have in our code. So we define short-term rentals as a use, and then we would add non-owner occupied short-term rentals as a commercial special exception in all of our single-family residential zoning districts, as well as neighborhood commercial and limited commercial zoning districts. A couple small changes to our food truck standards. Currently, food trucks are not permitted to operate in any of our residential zoning districts, so a food truck couldn't cater a graduation party or a birthday party. So we are just increasing the number of zoning districts in which a food truck can operate. So we're adding all of our single-family residential zoning districts, as well as parks and rec, agriculture, university, institutional, and neighborhood commercial. And then along with that, we're amending a small part on the duration section of the food truck standards, just to note that food trucks shall not operate more than 4 days per month on a given residential property. So a food truck would be permitted to operate on a residential property, just not indefinitely. These are just a few kind of disparate changes related to driveways and cul-de-sacs. The first is just that within residential districts, only one driveway shall be installed per property. This is just to remain consistent with Chapter 105 of the City Code, which says that only one driveway is allowed along local roads as opposed to our bigger collector and arterial streets. Most of our residential properties are located on local roads. So this is just to provide some cohesion with other parts of the code. This one would expand the width of non-residential driveways, the maximum width from 30 to 45 feet. Just in the time that I've been here, we've had 2 variances pass through the BZA for 2 of the new properties in the Midwest Industrial Park who needed more than the maximum 30 feet driveway width. So we were just increasing that. And again, this is non-residential driveway. And this is just for people who live on a cul-de-sac. They are permitted to encroach up to 5 feet into their front yard. This is just because of the irregular shape of their front yard. It kind of cuts off part of their yard. This is also something that we commonly see at the BZA. The next set of proposed changes are related to the city's climate action plan. The idea here is to incorporate the climate action plan into planning staff's internal processes. The climate action plan it's non-binding, and this wouldn't create any new regulations or enforcements. Essentially, whenever a petition goes to the Board of Zoning Appeals or Plan Commission or the Plat Committee, planning staff writes a staff report where we consider several different criteria and then make a recommendation to our boards and commissions. Some of those criteria are determined by state statute, and others have been developed by the city over time. This would just be adding consideration of the climate action plan as one of those criteria that planning staff would consider when making their recommendation. Just a change on surety standards. So whenever we have a large subdivision project that requires new public infrastructure, we require a performance bond. And this just changes the timing of that a little bit so that the performance bond must be accepted before construction begins. Some changes to residential accessory structure standards. These are sheds, pole barns, and so on. Specifically to the size of accessory structures. This has caused some conflict within some neighborhoods in the time that I've been here. So the first one is currently in our single-family residential zoning districts. You are permitted to have an accessory structure up to 20 feet tall, and this just modifies that a bit to say, or 100% of the height of the primary structure, whichever is less. So this is to avoid having primary structures accessory structures taller than primary structures. And then along similar lines, talking about the maximum size of an accessory structure, this just states that no single structure shall exceed 25% of the footprint of the primary structure for properties less than 1/2 of an acre. So again, trying to avoid or reduce the number of large accessory structure on more compact residential lots. I'll go over two of the miscellaneous proposed changes, specifically because these are the two where Plan Commission has recommended amending the language a little bit. So for one of these, we're adding an entirely new section to Article 5 for temporary construction facility standards. I think this is just something that has come up over the past couple of years where you'll have temporary construction facilities set up indefinitely, and the city doesn't really have much recourse or standards for these. So that's the purpose of this new section. And then in the duration section, we note that an approved temporary construction facility can act or can be up for a period not to exceed 18 months, and that a one-time 18-month extension may be granted. Plan Commission recommends changing that to just a one-time extension up to 18 months may be granted, just to provide some flexibility. And then in our outdoor storage standards for heavy industrial and high impact in those zoning districts, we currently have no screening requirements. We do have screening requirements in the lower intensity industrial, commercial, and medium intensity industrial zoning districts. So this is just, this would just add screening to these zoning districts. The Plan Commission was in favor of this change, but they recommended changing the language just to be more specific as to what we mean by a solid fence. And that's really all I have for the presentation. So thank you for being patient, and I'm happy to address any questions that you all might have.